When I was a little boy, I struggled with anger. As a little boy, and as the years progressed, I struggled with anger until I was into my 20s, when God finally graciously began to heal me. I was a little boy that, when he was two or so, would lie on the floor and bang his head on the concrete. My family was worried about me. And my grandfather, who was a very gentle man, this would be Bappa. I couldn't say Grandpa, so I called him Bappa. He would hold me in his arms, murmuring, "My dear, dear boy, my dear, dear boy, my dear, dear boy." And his patient, gentle words would slowly sink into me, and I would calm down. But the anger didn't go away, and my family didn't know what to do. I terrorized my younger brother. In fact, I learned from my older brother that when we lived in Phoenix, my older brother would coach my younger brother where he could hide from me when this anger would come over me. And I would, if I could get my hands on him, I'd beat him. And I would beat our dog Betsy that I loved so dearly. I loved Betsy. But this rage would come over me, and I'd beat that sweet dog. And it hurts to think about it. Hurts to think about it. Thankfully, God can transform people. Just takes some time, takes some effort. And happily, I got to share with my younger brother, Dave, who I would beat. With my younger brother, Dave, we were estranged for a long time, of course. Why wouldn't we be? He was hiding from me for years. When A Different Way came out, I talked about that experience with Dave, and I talked about being ashamed of what I had done, because it was indeed shameful. Shameful. And I didn't expect ever to hear from him. And I was taking a nap, and I woke up from the nap. This was maybe 6 months, a year ago. I woke up from a nap, and Deb was holding a cell phone. And she said, "It's Dave." And I thought, uh-oh, it's Dave. And she handed me the cell phone, and Dave said, no, I don't want you to be ashamed. No. And then he said, "I love you." And I said, Dave, I used to beat the hell out of you. And he said, "No, I forgive you. I forgive you." It's just a miracle of God, because Dave doesn't tell anybody in the family that he loves them. In fact, I called up my older brother, who was well aware of my past history, and I said, "Steve, Dave called me up." "Yeah?" And he told me he loved me. Really? This is the grace of God in action. So when we talk about anger, it's good to rehearse our anger history. So I'm going to ask you to do that this morning as we spend time together. What would people say if you rehearsed your anger history with them? How about the family? How about good friends? Why was I so angry at an early age? Well, when my mom was giving birth, too much anesthesia. The anesthesia seeped into her, and it seeped into me, and I wasn't held by my mom for over a week. So I didn't have that physical contact. Maybe that's part of it. DNA might be a factor. My dad, you would want him fighting on your side if a war broke out. But he was a volcano of anger that suddenly would appear. I was thinking about the dinner table in church today. I had forgotten this. We'd be at the dinner table, and we were rough to deal with, my brothers and I, and later my sister. And we had what we called he finally came up with a demerit list. He's a military guy. He came up with a demerit list, and he had a fly swatter. And if you got too many demerits, suddenly whack. And then if you really crossed the line, I would sit to his left at the dinner table, and I remember one time suddenly whack, and I was back on the floor because of something I had said or done. And that kind of a model, I think, probably had to do with my anger. I think there was probably spiritual warfare going on. The evil one preys off the cracks in our own personality. And he was attempting, I believe, from an early age to divert me from the path that God had for me. So he was preying probably on this crack in my personality. And I never lost my free will. I simply chose sometimes to do horrific things simply because I liked doing them. So, how about you? What's your anger history? What would those who know you best say? Now, sometimes we're quick to justify our anger. And yes, there are many things in the world that should arouse our anger. In the Bible, oppression of the poor, the widow, and the oppressed top the list. Jesus got angry, we say. Point taken. Yet Jesus was God incarnate, safe from the sin that warps our own nature so deeply. Bent creatures have a hard time being angry safely. Jesus wasn't bent like that. So be careful when we say, he would surely get angry here, I'm going to get angry too. Bent creatures act in bent ways. And this bentness manifests itself in the anger that oftentimes radiates from us. What would those who know you best say about you in the level of anger in your life? Thankfully, I've been healed in many ways. It makes me smile. I don't beat up people anymore. That's probably a good thing. Makes me smile. So we'll spend time with the desert dweller this morning, an Abba by the name of Abba Moses. Roberta Bondi, you remember her from last week? Roberta Bondi, To Love as God Loves. I hope you get that book, Fortress Press. Roberta Bondi says that the desert dwellers were well aware of the destructive nature of anger. Let me read it again, or say it again. Point of emphasis. The destructive nature of anger. Anger destroys things. We think we're going to remedy a situation. We get angry. It didn't remedy it. It made it worse. I'm not saying, as we'll see today, I'm not saying that we ignore situations that would call for, one would think, anger to be expressed. But there's a better way almost always to deal with the situation. Rebecca DeYoung, she's a sweet friend of mine. She's written a book called, you might pick this one up, I meant to bring it today and I forgot. She's written a book called Glittering Vices. Glittering Vices. Rebecca DeYoung, Glittering Vices. And she was a wise student of two desert dwellers, one a modern Abba, Dallas Willard, and an ancient one, Evagrius of Pontus. Dallas said this about anger. There's nothing that can be done with anger that cannot be done better without it. Isn't that good? When you hear something like that, I just got to stop for a minute and think about that. There's nothing that can be done with anger that cannot be done better without it. Evagrius says this. He says, anger always disturbs our prayer. Ain't it true? Find it easy to pray when you're really mad? Well, maybe if you're praying the judgment of God down on somebody's head, probably not a good idea. Lord will be apt to say, well, let's start with you then. Put on a crash helmet. Evagrius warns that communion with God is the goal of life and discipline, and anger infects our prayer. The funny thing about anger, this is like pride, I mentioned this last week. Anger clusters vices. It clusters vices. It's like a magnet that attracts the filings of vices such as these. And try to remember the last time you were angry and the anger blew up in your face. Anger clusters vices, resentment, pride, a condemning spirit. I know this is a bit astringent this morning. Passive-aggressive behavior. Oh, I'm not angry. Not bothering me. Passive-aggressive behavior. Near the top of the list, blindness to our own shortcomings. Blindness to our own shortcomings. Anger slows the heartbeat of our prayers. Slows the heartbeat of our prayers. Evagrius writes this: everything you do to avenge yourself against a brother or sister who has wronged you will become a stumbling block at the time of prayer. When you're praying as you should, such things will come over you that you may think it utterly just to resort to anger. But there is absolutely, this is strong now, it's Evagrius, but there is absolutely no such thing as just anger against your neighbor. And I can sense probably we're all thinking, oh, yeah, but you don't know. You don't know. And of course, God does know. If you search, Evagrius says, you'll find that it's possible, even without anger, for the matter to be settled properly. So we're not talking about ignoring things. We're not talking about sweeping something under the rug that should be dealt with. We're trying to avoid what Evagrius calls outbursts of anger that taint, wreak havoc on what we hope to accomplish through expressing our anger. Just pause for a moment. Think about the last time you lost your temper. Think about it. Did it really accomplish anything? Prayer, now moving into a more positive side of things, prayer is the offshoot. Prayer grows out of gentleness, freedom from anger, patience, kindness. I can't help myself. I start smiling when I use those words. Patience, kindness, gentleness. Wouldn't you be much more apt to talk about what's troubling you with someone like that? Someone who's created a space for you to enter and you know they're not going to yell. They're not going to condemn. And at the same time, they probably won't approve if you've been up to something that you haven't been up to, shouldn't have been up to. But you know they'll know what to do with it. Who's that remind you of? Jesus. So in this desert tradition that I like to spend time in, mastering anger is a key step in spiritual formation. So the goal is to be ever more, in our lives, the goal is to be ever more deeply formed and shaped into the image of Jesus. Yeah? More and more deeply formed into the image of Jesus. And for that to occur, pride last week, anger this week, fear next week, lust final week. We just got to deal with these things because they help nobody. And the goal of the spiritual life, why we're talking about these things, is to learn to love. Learn to love God, learn to love our neighbor. So every once in a while, we have to open up our heart, look and see what's there, and ask the Lord to invade that space and bring healing into all that stuff. And it's always a good thing if we approach it, if we approach these tough things by surrounding them with the grace of God. The grace of God. God knows what's in your heart. God knows what's in my heart. God knows what's there. And it's tremendously freeing to open up that iron box and allow all that stuff to come into the light of Christ. Couldn't be better. But we can get afraid. Or we can get angry. Or we can act like none of those things are true of my life. And that we call that pride. So we're going to spend time just for a moment or two with Abba Moses. Abba Moses was an Ethiopian, a tall man, strong man, and for much of his life, terribly angry. He was a slave for a while down in Nubia, which would have been the Sudan, and his master got so frustrated with him, he didn't want him as a slave anymore. Because Abba Moses, as Moses, was an angry man. He delighted in swimming across the Nile River. He'd put a knife in his mouth. Big, big man. Would swim across the Nile River. He knew there was someone across the Nile who owed him money, hadn't been paid, swam all the way across the Nile, knife in his mouth. The man who owed him the money saw him coming and fled, but left his sheep behind. And for the sheer pleasure of killing the sheep as a way of getting back at the man who owed him cash, he killed every one of them. Then he was strong enough to take 2 or 3 back across the Nile. On the other side, he started a fire, and he baked and cooked the sheep, ate them, and looked across the river at the man who had appeared on the ridge and nodded and said, "Don't cross Moses. Don't cross Moses." Yet at a certain point in his time, in his life, God was gracious. God is gracious all the time. He's calling us back into his kingdom. He's very gracious, and he touched Abba Moses' conscience. Abba Moses showed up at one of these desert communities of desert dwellers, desert fathers, desert mothers. He showed up and basically said, "I need help." His conscience was brought back to life. I need help. And God provided him with a mentor. And the mentor's name was Abba Isidore. Abba Isidore. And Abba Isidore realized Abba Moses needs a long space of time and quiet where he can calm down. And he needs to spend time with me in our relationship and take that time to calm down. And so he said, Abba Moses, probably like all of us, hoping for a quick solution. Abba Isidore said, I want you to go to your room. In these monastic communities, the room was called a cell. Go to your room, spend time there in silence and solitude. And at the same time that you're in silence and solitude, which are like a magnet to draw the truth of the matter to the surface in our lives, in the silence and solitude of that room, Abba Moses began to learn about himself. So he had a mentor who didn't run screaming into the night when he realized what Abba Moses was like. He was someone who might cause you to be afraid. But he showed up on Isidore's doorstep. Isidore took him under his wing, said, I'm going to spend time with you. I'm not going to give up on you. We're going to deal with this stuff. And then he interceded for Abba Moses with heartfelt prayer. Heartfelt prayer, time together, silence and solitude. And Abba Moses' self-understanding grew. And he himself became an Abba. He was recognized in these monastic communities as a man of deep understanding, kindness, patience, forgiveness, and someone who would never point his finger at another person and say, you're the one. There's a story I love about Abba Moses. So now years have passed. He's a changed man. And some younger brothers, in these stories, it's always the younger brothers who are confused. And there's some younger brothers, and there's someone who's been up to mischief in the monastic community. Somehow he had smuggled a woman into his room in a barrel. And the younger brothers knew about it. And they said, Abba, you've got to deal with the situation. And Abba Moses was reluctant. He knew his own past history. Got to deal with the situation. You're our Abba. And so what Abba Moses did, big guy, still fairly intimidating, I would think. He puts a cask of, in some of the stories it's water and some sand. He puts a cask on his shoulder, a big barrel on his shoulder. And then he pulled out a knife. That made everybody nervous. And he poked holes in the bottom of the barrel. And by this time in the story, all the brothers have quieted down because they know Abba Moses is trying to teach them something. What is this, Abba? What are you trying to teach us? And the old man said to them, my sins run out behind me, and I don't see them. And today, I'm coming to judge the errors of another. When they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him. Now think about that for a minute. I didn't get that story the first few times I read it. He says, I'm going to judge somebody else's sin. And my own sins are trailing out behind me, and I don't see them. I don't see them. So how can I, with clarity, judge somebody else's sin? Now, the judgment in this case involved condemning the brother. And the other brothers, the younger bucks, calmed down. And then the situation was dealt with. But in a manner that was much more wise, much more, if I could put it, Jesus-like than would have taken place at the beginning. Angry people, on the basis of the story, and I would say on the basis of Jesus' own teaching, angry people don't see their own sin and shortcomings. Tough question. What am I not seeing about myself that those nearest to me would gladly tell me, but they're afraid to do so? Angry people always feel their anger is justified. If you only knew why I'm angry, you'd be angry too. We can't allow something like this to pass with no one dealing with it. And today, I think it's fair to say, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think it's fair to say the United States of America is filled to the brim with angry people. Angry people who should be thumping their own chest, but are pointing, where people aren't listening to each other well anymore. This is not the way of Jesus. Shane Claiborne would say, it doesn't pass the Jesus smell test. It's not the way of the Holy Trinity. We're called to kindness, gentleness, patience, forgiveness. So think about this for a minute. Do you have a place where you can go to that's quiet? This place where you can go to where it's quiet, you can calm down, spend some time alone? He had his cell. And later when people would come to Abba Moses for advice and counsel, he would say to them, go to your cell. It will teach you everything you need to know. Go to your cell. It will teach you everything you need to know. So he came to be known as the most gentle and kind and patient of the Desert Fathers. You would have liked to have dinner with him. Some of the other ones, you wouldn't want to have dinner with them. But we would have liked to have dinner with him because he created a space for you to enter into where, as Greg Berger was saying this morning, you knew it was safe. And you would know with Abba Moses, it was safe to share with him. So a few questions. A little bit tough, but a few questions. When do you tend to get angry? Just ponder that with me. When do you tend to get angry? What sets you off? What lights your fuse? And can you see it? Just lit the fuse, and the fuse is starting to burn, and so what's going to happen? There's going to be an explosion of some kind. What sets you off? When was the last time you lost your temper? When was the last time you were really angry, and what did it accomplish? What did it accomplish? Do people walk on eggshells around you, fearful that at any time you may explode? Healing can come. Healing can come. Do you find yourself justifying your anger? It's not my fault. That is the classic expression of a human being who's incurvatus in se, turned in on himself, turned in on herself. It's not my fault. And then the finger goes out. They deserved it. Angry people, have to say it, angry people tend to be self-righteous. The people who killed Jesus, were very, very, very angry. And they thought their anger was justified. Just pause for a moment. In what situations do we find ourselves where we are convinced that our anger is justified? I'm not saying that the situation itself should not be dealt with, but how we deal with a situation is key. And angry people, I think it's fair to say, tend to be self-righteous. How to put this? They spend a lot of time looking around. Who's not measuring up? Who's not measuring up? What's going awry? It shouldn't be that way. Why aren't they changing? Why aren't things different? And sadly, anger can become a habitual response to life's challenges and difficulties. So let's move Abba Moses into the 21st century. What might he say? I think the first thing he would say would be, transformation begins with the love and grace of God. Jesus taught this all the time. He acted like this all the time. Transformation begins with the love and grace of God. Dealing with anger takes courage. It takes insight. The first step towards dealing with anger. Remember, anger expert. The first thing we keep in mind is to accept God's grace and to admit, I too have sinned. I too have sinned. We might have experienced the anger of others and have learned to reply in kind. You grow up in an angry environment, you're almost surely going to be an angry person. So a simple prayer that Abba Moses would teach us would be something like this. God, help me to take consistent, small steps toward kindness, gentleness, patience, and forgiveness. Lord, I can't take a big one. I've been angry all my life. Help me take a small one. Small step toward kindness, gentleness, patience, and forgiveness. All right, next one. Be gentle, kind, patient, and forgiving with yourself. I got a long history that has to do with anger. Be gentle, kind, patient, and forgiving with yourself. Remember what I said last week? I'll say it every time we're dealing with this material thing. Spiritual formation is the slowest of all human movements. The slowest of all human movements. And some of this stuff, because it's deeply embedded within us, it just takes time. So don't be surprised if later today you lose your temper. But at that point, take a step back and say, well, I momentarily lost my mind, didn't help the situation much. Lord, I offer that to you. By the power of your Spirit, lead me in a path that leads to healing. This is a good one. This is something that I do. Practice replacing anger with blessing. I have found it well nigh impossible to stay angry with someone I'm praying for. Have you found that to be true? If I'm really angry with someone and I pray like this, Lord, that's Lord, shower that person with your blessing. A prayer like that dissipates a host of evils that can trouble us. Tendency towards self-righteousness, tendency to justify ourselves, tendency to think, I'm the only one who's got this right. Shower your blessing on Donald Trump. Shower your blessing on Joe Biden. Shower your blessing on the murderer that I just read about, who committed a horrendous crime. This is not to say that we ignore the issues connected with all these situations. I hope you're catching that. It's that we learn to approach them in a different way. Next point, remembering we are often blind to our own shortcomings. We're often blind to our own shortcomings. And when I was a young guy, slowly getting over my anger, I'll tell you a story. A long, long time ago in a land far away, I used to play basketball. And so when you play basketball with guys, they get to know you really well. And I had come into the kingdom, and one of these guys, I could tell you his name, I still remember his name. Maybe I'll see him sometime. Said, I want to have dinner with you. Now, this is the guy I've spent a lot of time with. We're friends. And I said, sure. And so we sat down, we're having dinner. Now, basketball players are fairly earthy sometimes. And so we're having dinner, and he looks at me and he says, you know, I just want to tell you something. And I said, what? What? You make me feel like shit. And my response, really? He said, yeah, I just wanted you to know. But what happened as a result of that conversation, our friendship was strengthened rather than weakened. He didn't scream at me, he didn't yell at me, but he felt like that very direct earthly response was what I needed to hear. He didn't lose his temper. He took a chance. He took a chance because he knew me. He took a chance. This was when I was probably 21. He took a chance. I'm going to love you enough to, in my own earthy way, let you know how you're hurting me. I'm not going to lose my anger. I'm not going to get angry. But I want you to know. And I still remember that conversation today. Thank God for a friend like that. So I'm going to close with this. Keep your eyes and ears open for conversations or actions God may offer as a pathway out of anger into kindness, gentleness, and forgiveness. The encouraging thing is people can change. Transformation is possible. By the power of the Holy Spirit, a peaceful, kind life can really happen. So on that encouraging note, if I said one or two things today and they kind of resonated with you, oh, yep, that's me. All right, good. Jesus knew it all along. He knew it all along. And every time we spot something like that and hold on to something like that, healing comes. And we become more and more like the new person he's building into his image, and less like the old grizzly bear that used to live in Arizona. God bless you all.
Thank you. Well done.